Earlier this season, Manchester City did something that they basically never do. They lost 3 times in 4 consecutive games. But people weren't hugely surprised by this because Pep Guardiola was missing a player that he can't live without. Now, this player is absolutely fundamental in all phases of play. He's incredible defensively, he's brilliant in build-up, and he also offers things going forward as well. I am, of course, talking about Mr. John Stones. Now, on the board in front of me, I've got a quote from Pep Guardiola where he's talking about that period where they lost those games. And he said, the problem is when we don't play John Stones and Rodri at the same time. Why is that an issue? Well, because we have to play a little bit differently. So when John Stones isn't on the field, Manchester City have to do things in a different way. What is the result of that? Well, he goes on to say right at the end of this quote, we are not prepared to play many variations. So not having John Stones on the pitch means that Manchester City are less tactically flexible. Now, interestingly enough, a similar thing happened last season. John Stones wasn't available for a big chunk of the season, but he was brought back in the second half of the season, and actually his inclusion helped Manchester City towards their famous treble win. So let's just take some time and have a little refresher about what Manchester City looked like last season tactically. So here's Manchester City's famous 4-3-3 formation, but as everyone knows, it's not often that Manchester City are in this sort of structure when they have possession of the ball, because what Pep Guardiola has been so famous for is inverting one of his fullbacks, bringing them inside alongside the defensive midfielder to form a pivot, and then you end up with this familiar formation, this 3-2-2-3 formation, or a 3-2-5 as you'll often hear it termed as well. So what is it about this structure that Pep Guardiola likes? What are the advantages that Manchester City can get playing in this way? Well, the first thing is that you get central advantages. Now, in a recent TV interview, Pep Guardiola said that football is like chess. If you can control the middle, then you can control the game. So a big part of this is about controlling the center of the field, because what we have now is an extra player moved into the middle. With those 8s, then you've got 4 players in the midfield area. That means you're going to be able to control the middle of the pitch quite comfortably. Not only does that mean that you're going to be able to defend the middle against your opponents, but you're also going to be able to move the ball through them. If you can do these bounce passes through the opposition lines of pressure, you're then going to be able to mount these dangerous attacks in the central spaces around the goal. But it's not just central advantages you get here, you can also get wide advantages too, because by squeezing the middle of the field, you can squeeze the opposition closer together and open up space in those wide areas so that you can progress the ball and get advantages in those wide areas as well. Now, those are all in possession benefits, but there's also an out of possession benefit here as well, because teams like Manchester City are going to try and dominate possession, they're going to try and squeeze the opposition deep into their own half and retain possession around the edge of the box. But in the event that they lose the ball, they are then vulnerable to counter-attacks. And this structure actually gives you a really nice defensive base to work from, because this group of 5 players here can sit centrally and compact and actually stop the opposition from being able to run through the middle, force them wide, and increase the distances to their own goal. Now, in the second half of last season, the big tactical tweak that happened and made John Stones so important to Manchester City was that rather than inverting the fullback, what we actually saw was the centre-back stepping forward into that space. So what you've done here is you've ended up with exactly the same structure, but there are a few things we should mention about how this changes things. Now, the first thing we need to talk about here is about what happens in defensive situations, because as we said, the centre-back is only stepping forward in possession of the ball. When the ball is turned over, the centre-back is expected to get back into the last line of defence. And obviously the situation is going to change depending on which player is inverting. So if the centre-back steps forward, the quickest way back to the back line is going to be the same route that they've just come. But things change a little bit with the fullback, because if the fullback comes out here and the centre-back moves into a slightly wider position, then there's going to be 2 options for the fullback in terms of how they can return to the back line. Now, they may want to go back the way that they've come, but that is taking them away from the goal and is opening up a space here. So it may be more sensible for them to drop into this area here now, because the centre-back can fill in the space that they were just in. But again, we've got 2 problems here. One is that if they do go into the wide area, you're increasing the distance they have to return to the back line. But then the second problem is that if you do end up doing this rotation with the centre-back going out wide, you now have a fullback in the central line of the defence. And this may be a problem if the opposition are going to try and swing crosses in to your fullback, because your fullback might not have the same kind of profile as your centre-back. And there's another defensive benefit that you can get from pushing your centre-back forward in possession as well, and that is that rather than moving the fullback inside, pushing the centre-back alongside the pivot, you don't actually need to play a fullback who needs to play in the traditional way. You can actually start using them as an outside centre-back in possession, and that means that if you've got a centre-back here, you can then have 3 centre-backs in your back line playing as a situational 3, and then your pivot player as well, you can actually end up with a really physically dominant base at the bottom of your team's structure. The other thing we need to talk about here is what happens in build-up, because by having the centre-back stepping up in possession, what you can actually do is destabilise the opposition's pressing structure. So let's just add a front 4 along here, along the line. This is the way that a lot of teams will structure themselves out of possession. But in possession of the ball, what we're saying is we're going to have this movement of the centre-back stepping up alongside the defensive midfielder. Now this causes some problems. What happens with your press here? Do you have your front line dropping in to track the midfielder here? In which case you can now have the goalkeeper adopting the same sort of space and you've destabilised the attacking front line. Or do you simply allow the centre-back to sit here and rely on one of your teammates to make sure it doesn't become a problem? Now every team is going to deal with these sorts of problems in different ways, but the whole point of rotating your players around in your build-up structure is to pose problems to the opposition and to increase the possibility for the opposition structure to break down out of possession. And once that starts happening, then you can arrive at the holy grail of build-up play, and that is to find free men behind lines of pressure. So in this instance, the goalkeeper could find the pass through to the defensive midfielder, who could then play a bounce pass in behind the line of pressure to the centre-back, and now you've moved through that first line of pressure, your build-up's going well, you're into your second phase, and you can start thinking about attacking the opposition. And it's not just about getting through those lines of pressure. Actually, if you can have a centre-back who can push forward and actually join the front line of the attack, you're also going to get the benefit of that as well, because then you're not dependent on your defensive midfielder pushing forward, and so you don't become reliant on keeping your inverting centre-back in this kind of area here. You can actually rotate them with the pivot player, so the centre-back can join the front line sometimes, or the pivot player can, and that means that again you're going to be hard to track for the team out of possession. And that is why Stones is so perfect for the inverting centre-back role. In fact, when Pep Guardiola was asked about why he decided to move Stones into that position last season, he said in this quote, "John Stones can do everything. He is so intelligent and smart. That means he's going to be great in the build-up phase. He can move between the different lines. He can pop up in pockets of space and present himself as the free player. He makes incredible runs up front, so that means that he can join the front line for Man City, but also he's a good defender as well, and that touches on all of those areas that the inverting centre-back is expected to do." And that brings us to the beginning of this season, but Pep Guardiola has an immediate problem because John Stones isn't available, he is injured, and so something is going to have to change. Now, as we've already said, Pep Guardiola really likes that 3-2-2-3 structure that he used last season, but without John Stones, he has to do things differently on the pitch. And that means that Manchester City looked quite different for the first few games of the season. Now, in the first game of the season, they did try and play a similar sort of structure to last season. They had Rico Lewis inverting from fullback, but very quickly they changed the way that they were arriving in their in-possession structure. So this is the lineup for the game against West Ham, and as you can see, it looks quite different from what we're usually expecting to see from Man City. It's more of a 4-2-4 shape, which is very different from what we expect from the 4-3-3 shape. But what we're going to see is that City are still going to arrive in their regular structure with a front line of 5, 2 players behind them, and then a back 3. They're just going to do it in a different way, and the way that they're going to do that is by rotating in the wide area. So we've got Phil Foden playing as a right winger here. He's going to move inside, and that is going to create space then for Kyle Walker to push forward. So what we've done then is we've ended up with that front 5. We now have these 2 players in the pivot already behind them, and then we have a situational back 3 with all of these players being able to shift across to make up for Walker pushing forward. Now, why might Guardiola be deciding to structure things in this way? Well, I think his hands are tied a little bit by the personnel he has available to him, because in the past, he's had players like Riyad Mahrez who can play in the wide right spot, but this time around, he's got Phil Foden who can play there, he's got Bernardo Silva who can play there as well, but both of these players actually prefer moving inside. They prefer to do their attacking from the central spaces, and this means that you then have a problem who is going to provide width on the right-hand side. If you don't have anyone who can actually play as a forward, then the best thing to do is to use a really aggressive fullback in that same spot, so Kyle Walker can fill in there. And if you're forming your front 5 like this, by the fullback pushing on, you then have to play another midfielder alongside Rodri, because you can't have a fullback inverting or a centre-back stepping up. But this approach does come at a cost, because this is a much more rigid system in build-up. So we've already talked about how you can cause problems for opposition in build-up by moving a player from one line to the other, but in this situation, you're not going to be doing that at all, because you've got your 2 centre midfielders there already, and your back line here already as well. Now, that doesn't mean that Manchester City can't cause structural problems for the opposition. We actually saw them use this system really well against Newcastle, because by pushing Walker forward and moving Foden wide, they actually posed huge problems for Dan Burn, because the question is, if he is tracking Phil Foden and Foden goes inside, does Dan Burn go with him, in which case Walker can just run unimpeded down the line. Or if Burn chooses to stick with Walker, then it does mean that Foden can now drift in between the lines, and City now have a free man between the lines further up the field. And there's another problem here, and that is that if you're going to play someone like Bernardo alongside Rodri in the double pivot, you're actually keeping him away from the more dangerous areas on the field where he can really have an upside as well. And in fact, in the West Ham game, that is exactly what happened. It was clear that Pep Guardiola wanted to get Bernardo Silva further forward. And so in the second half, rather than pushing Walker forward, what we saw was Bernardo pushing forward, and you've still got your front five. And what we saw, in order to retain the defensive solidity that Pep likes to see from his system, we saw the two fullbacks actually inverting alongside Rodri. It's a slightly different shape here, but the same principles apply. You've got a really strong rest defensive unit here, which is going to protect City against opposition counter-attacks. And so by changing up their structure this season, Manchester City have actually become less flexible in their build-up in deeper areas, but they've also ended up moving attacking players further back on the pitch and away from those dangerous zones, which is something that Pep Guardiola will loathe.
Something else you might loathe is long podcasts. I know I do. And that's why we created the Daily Football Briefing Show. It's a 10-minute football podcast that tells you what happened last night, what's happening now, and what's going to happen. Hey, it's available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Search for the Daily Football Briefing Show. It's on the internet, and you know how to use that because you're already here.
Well, thanks for that, Ian, but let's get back to the most important topic in the world: John Stones. So what happens as soon as John Stones is available this season? Well, Pep Guardiola goes back to the old system. And that makes sense because the first few teams that Manchester City played after John Stones came back play a man-oriented pressing system, and that means you want a really flexible build-up structure. And so let's take a look at one of those games now. That game is the Manchester Derby, and the important thing to remember about Manchester United is that they like to go man-to-man in the midfield phase against big teams. So I've got the teams on the board here, and as we can see, Manchester City are in their starting 4-3-3 shape, and that means that Manchester United are going to match them in the midfield area. So we've got Amrabat and Alvarez, Eriksen on Bernardo, and then McTominay pushing forward to make sure Rodri is kept quiet. And what that means is that if you're really flexible in your build-up shape, then you can actually cause spaces to open out and move the ball through lines of pressure. So what we saw happening a lot actually was Rodri dropping into the back line here like this, pulling McTominay with him, and that opens up space in this area here. And in those moments, we saw a counter movement from John Stones into the space that had opened out. And again, you have that same question. What happens with Haaland? Does he stay on the opposition back line, or does he drop to follow Stones with him? Now, if he doesn't drop to follow Stones, then you have an overload in the central area now because you have two midfielders tracking three players. And if this happens, now Christian Eriksen is faced with the problem. Does he track John Stones or stay with Bernardo? If he goes one way or the other, he's going to be leaving a free player. And actually what we saw a few times was Eriksen tracking Stones. You now have Bernardo and Grealish free around Diogo Dalot. That means you can work the ball into these sorts of areas, get the ball on the byline, play the ball back across the goal. And Erling Haaland had a few headed chances from just these sorts of situations, one of which resulted in a goal. Now, if Eriksen stays with Bernardo Silva and leaves John Stones free, then actually what we saw a few times in the game was him really trying to attack the seam between the centre-back and the full-back. Now, Evans can step forward to try and keep Stones occupied, but that does mean that Maguire and Haaland are in a 1v1 matchup in the back line, which is quite exploitable, and then Stones can just breeze past Evans into this wide area and cause problems from there. And so those double movements that John Stones and Rodri are making to pull the opposition pressing structure apart have become really effective. I've just got a few screenshots to show you here of this happening in action. So here we have John Stones stepped up, here's Rodri alongside him. You can see McTominay is tight on Rodri because they go man for man in midfield. Here's Amrabat on one of the eights. Here's Eriksen tracking the other eight who's over here. And what we're going to see is we're going to see Rodri dropping into the first line of Manchester City's build-up, and John Stones is going to try and find this space here. So if we move the tape on, we can see there's Rodri, he's now in the back line, but we can see John Stones now has found this pocket of space between the front line of Manchester United's press and their midfield. Eriksen has come right across to try and track him. There's the space that John Stones can run into if he wants to make that seam run. But importantly, Christian Eriksen has left Bernardo Silva in this area. That means there's an overload in this part of the pitch involving Bernardo Silva, Jack Grealish and Diogo Dalot. And that was the area that Manchester City really caused problems for Manchester United throughout that game. Now, it is important to note that what we're talking about here is structural movement. So we can see John Stones has moved into a different area of the pitch to cause problems for Manchester United out of possession. So you might be forgiven for thinking that anyone can play this role as long as they can move from the back line into the midfield. They're going to destabilise the opposition's structure and it's going to cause problems for them. But the important thing to remember is that player profile is super important here, because it's not just the case that John Stones is moving the opposition around. He's also going to be in a position where he's going to receive the ball, often in tight spaces. And as you can see, he's got 4 Manchester United players around him. But in order for him to be so dangerous here, he has to be a threat. That means that if the ball does come to him in this space here, he has to be able to make quick decisions about what he's going to do and have the technical ability to be able to move the ball on as well. And that's why not just any profile of player can play this role, and why John Stones is actually so remarkable. Because a few weeks after this game, John Stones got injured again, and Manchester City tried to play the same system with a different player, and it didn't go quite so well. So this is a screenshot from the recent game against Chelsea, and as we can see, Man City have done that double movement where Rodri drops into the back line, and Akanji, is the centre-back here, has actually pushed forward into the midfield space. And you can see why he might do that, because you've got Conor Gallagher here between the two players. Does he step onto Rodri, in which case Akanji is free, or does he stay on Akanji, in which case Rodri is free? And this is why those rotations happen. So if we fast forward the tape, we can see that Akanji has actually pulled Gallagher across with him, and now Rodri is the free player. But as we've said, it's not just about creating these structural inequalities, you actually have to have the right players in each position to really be able to exploit them. And this is something that Manchester City struggled to do in this game. So we've got a really nice example here of what ends up happening. Here's Ruben Diaz on the ball. Chelsea have a really nice out of possession structure where they're sitting between a lot of players. So for example here, you've got Guardiola in an amount of space that if the ball is played to him, you're going to see Cole Palmer jump straight onto him immediately. Here's the double pivot here, and you can see Akanji has jumped up from the back line into the midfield area. But you can see Conor Gallagher and Nicholas Jackson are just making sure that those passing lanes aren't open so that they can't be exploited very well. But even though Chelsea are marking really well here, there's still plenty of scope for Manchester City to be able to move the ball through the lines, and the difference between this succeeding and not succeeding then is down to personnel. When you have Akanji there rather than John Stones, you aren't able to have quite the same movement, quite the same level of technicality to be able to exploit this system. And in the end, Manchester City couldn't build through the Chelsea press, so what happens in these situations is that Diaz started playing quite speculative balls into the wide channels, which is a much less effective way of progressing the ball and using those central advantages that we talked about that allow Manchester City to move the ball through different phases of play. So John Stones is a player that Pep Guardiola cannot live without. Last season, he made the difference as Manchester City went on to win a famous treble. But the big question is whether or not he'll be back from injury soon enough to be able to help Manchester City make the difference this time around.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.